Building back broader is the new phrase opined by the World Economic Forum. This notion goes to the heart of the fusion of monetary and fiscal policies and lets central banks completely control their governments. Today we investigate how central banks have taken complete control. So let's dive on in. Now, this channel provides global macro insights and champions the importance of sound money in a world gone crazy, so please do consider subscribing. In 2019, BlackRock's Dealing with the Next Downturn document really uncovered the policy framework that would be used by governments and ably supported by central banks to ensure adequate policy response to the next downturn. In this seminal document, they argued that there was not sufficient monetary policy space to combat the next downturn. And this is clearly evident given the low level of interest rates that were, of course, apparent at the time and the lack of manoeuvre they offered. It's particularly important when you consider it normally requires around 5 full percentage points of cuts to combat typical downturns. But in addition, that fiscal policy would not be sufficient to support an economic recovery on its own. Thus, BlackRock advocated going direct, which means the central bank finding ways to get central bank money directly into the hands of the public and private sector spenders. Now, to do this, it required an explicit and permanent monetary financing of fiscal expansion, or so-called helicopter money. The intention of this policy approach seemed clear to get currency into the real economy for GDP transactions and thereby push up inflation. The inflation tax can then erode the real value of a nation's debt, of course. And this is just what has been seen and has been so fundamentally different between the quantitative easing response from 2008 to that which we see right now. Given that central banks are directly financing state transfer payments, it means that currency flows into the real economy, very much unlike the increased bank reserves that simply fueled asset price growth from 2008 onwards. Inevitably, Zimbabwean-style explicit monetary financing in sufficient size will push up inflation, and so it hardly comes as a surprise to hear the Food and Agriculture Organization announce a 33% increase in global food prices in the year to August 2021. And it's thus for good reason why some believe that we are entering the most aggressive global hiking cycle in over a decade, as we can see in this excellent chart. Yet this is of course more attainable for some nations rather than others, given the sheer scale and size of their national debts. And thus it's no surprise that Powell has really come under fire as the inflation figures have scared equity markets in recent weeks. Yet BlackRock did warn that without explicit boundaries, direct debt monetization would undermine institutional credibility and could lead to uncontrolled fiscal spending. Hence why we now see the squabbles over debt ceilings. Yet we are all now in the realms of permanent monetary financing courtesy of the central banks. This is certainly being championed by the likes of the World Economic Forum, who have written a detailed white paper on building back broader in what they state are policy pathways for economic transformation. Yes, transformation. This is structural transformation we're witnessing, of course. Instead, they simply reflect ever-increased debts due to central banks courtesy of maddening debt monetization, together with Marxist interventionist economics and the picking of winners and losers. Notice the WEF's key partners, of course. Entrepreneurship and the importance of SMEs are given passing reference as they employ around 70 to 80% of jobs globally, as the WEF kindly admits, but out of the 77 pages it receives very small passage, as you can see here. Instead, inclusivity, equity, carbon neutrality and social justice receive much endorsement. And so traditionally it's been perceived that voters were said to determine fiscal policy via their elected politicians and their manifestos. To what extent is of course very debatable. While independent central banks were in charge of monetary policy, however, this new fusion of monetary and fiscal policy puts private banks and bankers in charge of both the monetary and fiscal policy, and ensures that the nation state is bankrupted courtesy of the bankers. But the real question is, what have the central banks themselves actually asked for in return for this permanent state of debt monetization? Clearly, the demand for a digital ID is paramount here, given that central banks long for complete control via central bank accounts, or CBDCs, and this requires that digital ID. Right now, we see only those developed countries with already established digital IDs now opening up, and this hardly strikes me as a coincidence. But many, including Catherine Austin Fitts, see this Build Back broader fusion of monetary and fiscal policy as a financial coup, where the state's assets are seemingly transferred to undisclosed secret entities on behalf of the central bank. The electorate and their voice receives only lip service, while the nation is bankrupted and the assets plundered. And so, of course, this is grim reading for anyone in Western economies who believes in laissez-faire, small-scale entrepreneurship, not this phony notion of crony capitalism that we actually see around us, and this movement towards a Sovietization of our economies. Now, I think it's so important for us to make sure that we actually preserve our wealth, and of course I will continue to maintain a holding of gold and silver despite the actual relative poor performance that we've actually seen over the last 18 months or so of that asset class. But in addition, this whole building back broader approach really does highlight the need for us to actually make sure that we raise our voices and tell others of our concerns here. We must speak up. Otherwise, the consequences really will be quite profound. And so what resources are the elite actually going after? Well, they are going after real asset classes. And so while we are seeing fine performance in the crypto market still, we are still seeing lackluster performance in many of the real markets, particularly gold and silver. But notice how there has been colossal investment taking place in land and the ability to actually produce food is of course of enormous value, and there are still some countries offering freedom to those who do believe in laissez-faire, small-scale entrepreneurship. Now, thanks so much for joining me. I hope this was a useful episode. Do hit the like button, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye bye.